Hi guys, I thought we would go back to reading some of the scary stories. So we've got the third book, because I think that's the one I've read the least from. Just looking at a small list, that one I think I've only done 2 stories. So we're going to actually do the very first story in this one. It's called Hide and Seek. Eric Jones loved the house that he and his mother had moved into. It was a far cry from the cramped apartment that they had lived in New York City. Their new house was in a little village in Vermont. When Eric looked out of his window, he didn't see the dirty streets of Manhattan below him. Instead, he saw green, rolling hills. And the house was huge, too. It had been built at the turn of the century and had 3 fireplaces and wonderful high ceilings. There was a great front parlor with a winding staircase and 5 large bedrooms. But the best part of all was the stables. There would be a place to put a horse if he could talk his mother into letting him have one. The only thing that bothered Eric was what he had heard about the house from old man Mackenbecker, his new next-door neighbor. On the day they had moved in, Eric and his mother had gone next door to introduce themselves. Mr. Mackenbecker had seemed nice enough, but when he heard they had bought the house next door, his face had turned white. He'd bought that house himself, he explained, years ago, as a wedding gift to his bride. They were to have gotten married in the front parlor, but on the day of the wedding, she disappeared and had never been heard from again. Eric and his mom listened carefully as Mr. Mackenbecker told the story. The bride had been trying to hide from her new husband because she didn't want him to see her before the wedding. Before he knew it, everyone was playing a game of hide and seek, even the bridesmaids. But when Mr. Mackenbecker's bride hid, no one could find her. 60 years had passed, and no one had ever seen her again. Mr. Mackenbecker figured that she had never wanted to marry him in the first place and had run away to get out of the whole mess. But whatever had happened, Eric could tell that it had left Mr. Mackenbecker heartbroken. Mr. Mackenbecker explained that he knew he could never live in the house and sold it immediately. He had moved next door. But the new owners had never moved in, and no one had lived there until Eric and his mother had moved in that day. It was a weird story, all right. A weird story that Eric tried not to think about, especially at night. But what was even weirder were the sounds that he had started hearing at night before he went to bed. They were hard to describe. They sounded a little like scratching. Then they would grow louder, turning into pounding noises, and they came from directly above his room from somewhere in the attic. The first time he had heard them, he had gotten his mother and asked her to come into his room, but the sounds had stopped by the time she had gotten there. She had insisted that it had been his imagination. He'd heard it again the next night and called to his mom, but again the sounds had stopped as soon as she walked into the room. One night, when Eric's mother was out for the evening and Eric was home alone, the sounds grew louder than ever. The pounding got more and more intense until the ceiling of Eric's room began to shake. Eric was really frightened, but he couldn't think of anything to do. If he called his mom, he would ruin her date, and she probably wouldn't believe him anyway. I know, Eric thought to himself. I'll go over to Mr. Mackenbecker's. He'll know what to do. He grabbed his bathrobe, put on his tennis shoes, and headed next door. After he knocked on Mr. Mackenbecker's front door, he realized how stupid he was being. If his own mom didn't believe him, why would Mr. Mackenbecker? He decided to go back home, but by then it was too late. Mr. Mackenbecker answered the door. "I'm sorry to bother you so late," Eric began. Then he decided that since he was already there, he might as well tell the whole story. When Eric was all finished, Mr. Mackenbecker shook his head. "Well, son, I don't rightly know what you've been hearing, but if it were me, I sure would be investigating what was up there. Probably rats or bats or squirrels, but I'd sure want to know. They can all do some damage to an attic." Eric thought for a second. There was no way that he would go into that attic by himself. He looked at Mr. Mackenbecker with pleading eyes. "Do you want me to go with you?" Mr. Mackenbecker asked. Eric nodded. "You know I haven't set foot in that house for 60 years, don't you?" Eric nodded again. "Mr. Mackenbecker, please, you have to go with me. My mom doesn't believe me, and I just have to find out what's making those noises." Okay, Mr. Mackenbecker said. "I guess I'm probably old enough to pretend that I don't remember what happened there. Just let me get my coat and a flashlight." When Mr. Mackenbecker returned, the two of them crossed the yard to Eric's house. They stopped in Eric's room first, and sure enough there was the sound. Only this time it was a light pounding only every once in a while. It was almost like whoever was making the noise had become tired. "Well, my boy," Mr. Mackenbecker said, "you know what we've got to do." They headed to the door that led to the attic. They began walking up the attic stairs. They hadn't heard the pounding for several minutes now, but Eric was still shaking. Whoever, or whatever, was making that sound was somewhere up there, waiting. They reached the top and looked around. There were a few old pieces of furniture covered with dust and some old boxes. Mr. Mackenbecker turned his flashlight on what looked like a figure in the corner. Eric gasped. It was a person! A person all dressed in white. Mr. Mackenbecker chuckled. Just an old dressmaker's dummy, nothing to be afraid of. Now let's see, your room is right underneath that corner over there, see? Right by that old trunk? Come on, let's see if we can't scare us up some rats. Eric followed Mr. Mackenbecker to the corner of the attic where the trunk was. Neither of them heard a sound. No pounding, no scratching, nothing. Here's your answer, Mr. Mackenbecker said. There's probably a nest of rats in this here trunk. Let's open it up and see. Eric's palms became clammy. He sure didn't want to see a trunk full of rats, that's for sure, but it was better than imagining what terrible thing was making that noise. Mr. Mackenbecker jiggled the lock on the trunk. The lock's pretty tight and this trunk seems real solid, but rats have been known to eat through anything. Mr. Mackenbecker pulled at the lock again, but it wouldn't budge. Eric pulled a Swiss Army knife out of his pocket. Here, will this help? He asked. Mr. Mackenbecker took the knife and worked on the lock. Suddenly it sprung open. Are you ready, my boy? Rats aren't very pretty, you know. Mr. Mackenbecker opened the lid of the trunk. Eric closed his eyes for just a second. When he opened them, he expected to see hundreds of squirming rats. But what he saw was far, far worse. He heard Old Man Mackenbecker scream. In the trunk, dressed in a beautiful ivory satin wedding dress, with a lace veil covering a shock of gray hair, was a skeleton. Its arms were outstretched as if it had been pounding the inside of the trunk, and on the inside of the trunk lid, there were long, bloody scratch marks. The look on Mr. Mackenbecker's face told Eric all that he needed to know. It was the skeleton of Mr. Mackenbecker's bride. They had found her hiding place, and she had been trying to get out of the trunk for 60 years. Have a spooky day.